Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a massive question, one that really gets to the heart of major world religions.
It's a big one.
Are the sacred texts, the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, or are they purely human creations, historical documents put together over time? Or is there something more, a divine author, divine inspiration?
Yeah, and this whole discussion really sits right at that tricky crossroads of faith, history, and how we even read texts.
Absolutely.
So our goal here really is to lay out the arguments from both sides. You've got the skeptical academic view, and then you have the perspective of faith. We're not here to pick a winner.
No.
The aim is more to distill the logic, see where the common ground is based on, established historical facts. What's fascinating is that the real split often isn't about the facts themselves, it's about the method. How do you decide what's true in the first place? That's epistemology, and that's often the root of the disagreement.
That's a crucial distinction. Same documents, totally different lenses. Okay, so let's start with the academic approach, the historical critical method, right? Treating scripture like any other ancient text, just for a moment, putting the divine question aside.
Exactly. And when you do that, when you apply standard historical and literary analysis looking at language, archaeology, context, the evidence for human authorship seems, pretty substantial.
How so? What jumps out immediately?
Well, first, the cultural context. These texts didn't appear in a vacuum. They're soaked in the specific time and place they came from. Their language, laws, metaphors, it all reflects a particular ancient society.
So the time and place shaped the text itself. Can you give an example?
Sure. Take the Genesis creation story in the Hebrew Bible. From a purely historical critical view, it shares a lot of themes, even structure, with older myths from the ancient Near East, like the Babylonian Enuma Elish.
Ah, right.
So the non-believing scholar might see it as, an Israelite response to or adaptation of stories already circulating in their culture. Or look at the Quran. Its revelations are deeply connected to the specific social, political, even legal situations happening in 7th century Arabia. So the skeptic asks, if this is an eternal, unchanging divine message, why does it seem so tailored to one specific historical moment?
That makes sense from that perspective.
Yeah.
It suggests the writers were working with the material around them, their own world.
And it's not just the external context. Scholars also point to an evolution of ideas within the texts themselves.
What do you mean by evolution?
Well, again, in the Hebrew Bible, the way God is portrayed seems to shift over time. You might see an earlier picture that's more like a powerful tribal deity, almost a warrior figure, and later developments emphasize a universal God focused on ethics and justice. To the critical historian, that looks like human religious thought developing, refining itself over centuries, not necessarily a single static divine revelation downloaded all at once.
Okay, so context, evolution of ideas, and that leads straight to the big one, authorship. Tradition often assigns single authors, right? Like Moses for the Torah.
Right. But the historical critical method really challenges that. The consensus among many, many scholars, particularly for the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible.
The Pentateuch.
Yes, the Pentateuch. The view is that it wasn't written by Moses alone in the desert. Instead, it looks like a complex tapestry woven together from several older source documents.
The JEPD sources.
Exactly. Those labels represent different theorized sources, often identified by, say, different names used for God or distinct narrative styles or theological concerns. The idea is these were compiled and edited together over a long period.
And the New Testament Gospels. Similar story.
A similar kind of analysis, yes. Most scholars believe they were written decades after Jesus' life, not as immediate first-hand reports by the apostles Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John themselves.
Okay.
They seem more like accounts shaped by the early Christian communities, reflecting their understanding and preaching about Jesus based on traditions passed down.
And then there's the physical evidence, the text we actually have. You see signs of human handling there, too.
Oh, definitely. 2 crucial points here. First, we don't have the originals. The actual physical first document penned by the autograph, it's gone for virtually all major sacred texts.
So we only have copies.
Copies of copies of copies made over centuries. And because they were copied by hand, variations crept in. Little slips of the pen, sometimes bigger changes.
Like what kind of changes?
Most are minor spelling or word variations, but some are pretty significant. The traditional ending of Mark's Gospel, for instance, isn't found in the very earliest manuscripts. Or that famous story about the woman caught in adultery in John's Gospel, it seems to be a later addition.
Wow. Okay, so no originals and variations in the copies. What's the second point?
Internal issues, things within the text itself. You have apparent contradictions, say, the Gospels giving different details about the same event, like the resurrection appearances.
Right.
And then there are claims that seem to conflict with modern science, a literal reading suggesting a global flood covering the highest mountains, or an Earth that's only about 6,000 years old.
So from that purely secular historical critical standpoint, you can build a case that explains it all without invoking the divine.
Correct. The non-believer might look at prophetic experiences, visions, hearing voices, and suggest psychological explanations, maybe temporal lobe epilepsy, maybe just charismatic personality.
And the function of the texts themselves.
Seen primarily as sociological, they provide laws to organize a society, myths to create shared identity, ways to legitimize rulers, serving very human needs.
So the conclusion from this viewpoint is pretty clear. These texts look human, feel human, have signs of human error and development. So they're likely human creations. Complex, powerful, but human.
That's the essence of the skeptical or historical critical case.
Yes, let's hold that thought, because now we need to completely flip the perspective. Billions of people accept many of those same historical facts, the cultural context, the human writers, the transmission issues, but they reach a radically different conclusion. So let's shift gears. How does the believer's framework operate? If you start with the assumption that God is communicating, how do you integrate these historical realities?
The key concept, really, across many faiths, is divine inspiration, and it's often understood as a kind of partnership model.
Partnership, meaning God and humans working together.
Exactly. Most thoughtful believers will agree. Yes, humans wrote these words. They used their own languages, styles, cultural understanding. But the belief is that God was guiding, inspiring, working through those human authors.
So the human element isn't seen as a problem.
No, it's often seen as the point. The humanity of the text, its specific cultural setting, the author's personality shining through that's viewed as the chosen vessel. God condescends, you might say, to speak in ways humans of that time and place could understand. It's seen as fully human and fully divine simultaneously.
That completely changes how you judge the text then.
Right.
It's not aiming to be a modern science or history book.
Precisely. Believers argue its primary purpose is theological truth, moral guidance, revealing the path to salvation or right living. It's about spiritual transformation, not necessarily passing a 21st century fact-checking test on geology or precise chronologies.
So those apparent contradictions or historical inaccuracies we mentioned, how are they handled?
Often seen as relatively minor issues, maybe the static of human transmission or differences you'd expect from multiple independent witnesses recounting complex events, they don't, for the believer, invalidate the core divine message, the signal.
And believers also point to the impact of these texts, right, as evidence for something more than human.
Yes, that's a major line of argument, sometimes called the argument from transformation and witness, meaning they look at the sheer world-changing impact, the emergence of radical monotheism from polytheistic cultures, the incredibly rapid unification of Arabia under the banner of the Quran, the explosive growth of Christianity against all odds in the Roman Empire. Believers argue these kinds of transformations are just too profound, too unique to be explained only by human factors like good ideas or charismatic leaders. They feel a supernatural explanation is required.
Are there arguments based on the text itself? Internal proofs?
Yes, specific arguments exist within different traditions. For Muslims, a central one is the ijaz, the linguistic inimitability of the Quran.
Inimitability.
The idea that the Quran's Arabic is so perfect, so eloquent, so complex, especially given that the Prophet Muhammad was traditionally considered illiterate, that it simply could not have been produced by a human being. It's presented as a logical miracle.
Okay. And for Christians or Jews?
Often the argument involves fulfilled prophecy, pointing to specific predictions made in the Old Testament, sometimes centuries in advance, that seem to find their fulfillment later, perhaps in the life of Jesus or historical events. This is argued as evidence of a divine mind orchestrating history and revelation.
So how do believers, especially maybe more modern, educated believers, respond to those specific scholarly points we raised earlier? Like the JEDP sources for the Torah, do they just reject that scholarship?
Not necessarily. This is where it gets quite nuanced. Many contemporary believers are well aware of and even accept the findings of historical critical scholarship. They might agree, okay, yes, it looks like the Torah was compiled from different sources like J, E, D, and P.
But they don't see that as undermining its divinity.
No. They argue that God's inspiration wasn't just limited to the initial writers, but extended to the entire process. God guided the compilers, the editors, the ones who skillfully wove those sources together over centuries to create the final text we have. The final form is what's considered divinely inspired.
I see. So the process itself was guided. What about borrowing from other cultures? Like the flood story parallels between Genesis and Gilgamesh.
Again, different approaches. One common view is that the non-biblical myth, like Gilgamesh, is actually a distorted memory of a real historical event, like a great flood. And the Bible contains the divinely preserved, accurate version.
So the myth is the corrupted version, the Bible is the true one.
That's one line of reasoning. Another is that God intentionally used a common, familiar story pattern. Everyone in that culture knew flood stories as a vessel, a familiar framework to teach a unique theological lesson about judgment, sin, and God's grace, different from the pagan versions.
So acknowledging the similarity, but giving it a divine purpose.
Exactly, reinterpreting the historical data through the lens of faith. And the same goes for canonization, the process of deciding which books belong in Scripture.
Like the Council of Nicaea or Caliph Uthman standardizing the Quranic text.
Yes, believers generally don't see those human councils as deciding which books were divine. Rather, they see them as recognizing the books that the community of faith, guided by God's Spirit over time, had already come to accept as inspired. The human process confirmed a divinely guided consensus.
Okay, this is fascinating because we've laid out two really coherent, internally consistent ways of looking at the same evidence.
They are. Both frameworks have explanations for the data.
So let's try to synthesize this. Where is the actual common ground? What facts do both the skeptic and the believer generally have to agree on?
Okay, common ground number one, historical reality. Both sides really must acknowledge that these are ancient texts. They were written down by human hands, in specific human languages, within concrete historical and cultural settings.
You can't deny the human fingerprints all over them.
You really can't, not if you're engaging with the historical evidence. Denying the cultural embeddedness just isn't historically credible.
And what's the second point of agreement?
Common ground number two, human transmission. Both sides have to agree that the texts have a human history. They were copied, collected, edited, sometimes compiled from sources, and eventually selected by human communities or councils. We don't have the originals. We have texts shaped by a long human process.
Right, whether it's scribal errors or councils deciding the canon.
The fact of human involvement in the preservation and shaping of the text over time is undeniable.
So if both sides agree that humans wrote them in specific times and humans transmitted and compiled them, where is the fundamental disagreement? What's the wall they hit?
The wall is the core claim itself, divine inspiration. That claim is fundamentally theological, not historical or scientific.
Meaning you can't test it in a lab.
Exactly. You cannot use empirical methods, history, archaeology, science to definitively prove or disprove that a transcendent God was involved in guiding those human authors and compilers.
Why not?
Because those methods are designed to study the natural, observable world. They're excellent at showing that humans wrote the texts and how the texts were transmitted. They can show inconsistencies or historical inaccuracies, but they can't logically rule out the possibility of a supernatural cause working through those very human processes, including human fallibility.
So the historical method can show human involvement, but it can't prove humans were the only factor involved.
Precisely. It can demonstrate human agency, but it cannot, by its own rules, disprove divine agency operating alongside or through it.
So the whole debate boils down not to the documents themselves or their basic history, but to the interpretation you bring to that history.
That's it in a nutshell. The historical critical view tends to follow Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually best. A text that looks human-made probably is just human-made.
While the believer says,
The believer looks at the text's profound message, its transformative power, maybe specific features like prophecy or ijaz, and concludes that human agency alone isn't a sufficient explanation. They posit a divine source is necessary, working through the human authors and processes.
it really comes down to your starting point, your fundamental worldview, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Are you starting from a position where only natural, empirical explanations are allowed? Or is your worldview open to the possibility of the transcendent, the divine, interacting with the world? That initial choice shapes how you interpret all the evidence that follows.
Wow. So this deep dive really underscores that. The facts, ancient documents, human authors, cultural settings, historical transmission are largely agreed upon. But the meaning, the ultimate source, that hinges entirely on interpretation and worldview.
It does, which leads to a really interesting question, maybe something for you, the listener, to think about.
Okay.
If you accept the believer's definition of Scripture's purpose, that it's primarily about revealing theological truth, guiding morality, offering salvation, does finding historical or scientific inaccuracies by modern standards actually invalidate it for its intended purpose?
Are we judging it by the right criteria?
That's the question. How should we evaluate ancient literature meant for spiritual transformation? Judging it solely as a history or science textbook might be missing the point entirely, depending on your perspective. It really forces you to consider your own foundational assumptions.
A very compelling thought to leave us with. Thank you for walking us through such a complex topic today. And for you listening, we really encourage you to dig into these texts and the debates around them for yourself.